The autumn breeze rustled through the playground of Riverside Elementary School as Mrs. Emma Thompson prepared her kindergarten classroom for another day. At 42, she had spent the last 15 years shaping young minds in this very room, decorating the walls with colorful alphabet charts and her students' artwork. Her gentle brown eyes and warm smile had earned her the reputation of being everyone's favorite kindergarten teacher. Among her 20 students this year was 5-year-old Sarah Miller, a bright-eyed girl with honey blonde pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. Sarah had started the school year as one of the most enthusiastic students, always the first to raise her hand during story time and eager to share her drawings during art class. Her infectious laugh would often fill the classroom, making even the most serious of children join in. However, over the past few weeks, Mrs. Thompson had noticed troubling changes in Sarah's behavior. The once vibrant child had become unusually quiet, often sitting alone during playtime instead of joining her friends at the building blocks corner. Her colorful drawings of happy families and rainbow-filled skies had been replaced by dark scribbles, and she had stopped printing her favorite stuffed unicorn to show and tell Fridays. Mrs. Thompson kept detailed notes about these changes, as she did with all her students who showed signs of distress. She had tried speaking with Sarah's mother, Jennifer Miller, during the last parent-teacher meeting, but the woman had seemed distracted and nervous, constantly checking her phone and making excuses to leave early. Jennifer was a single mother who had recently started dating someone new, according to the emergency contact form update she'd submitted to the school office. One particular Monday morning, Mrs. Thompson arrived earlier than usual to prepare for the day's autumn-themed activities. As she arranged pine cones and colorful leaves on the craft table, she heard the familiar sound of small feet shuffling in the hallway. The early arrival students were beginning to file in, their parents dropping them off before heading to work. Sarah was among the first to arrive that day, which was unusual since she typically came in with the later group. Mrs. Thompson noticed immediately that something was different. The little girl's hair was uncombed, her shoelaces untied, and her usually neat school uniform was wrinkled. More concerning was the way Sarah clutched her backpack to her chest like a shield, her small knuckles white from gripping the straps too tightly. "Good morning, Sarah," Mrs. Thompson called out cheerfully, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy despite her growing concern. "Would you like to help me set up the leaf printing station?" Sarah merely shook her head, moving quietly to her assigned seat in the back of the classroom. She pulled out her worn copy of The Very Hungry Caterpillar, but didn't open it, just staring at the cover with unfocused eyes. Mrs. Thompson watched as the little girl's shoulders trembled slightly, a sight that made her teacher's heart ache. As more students filtered in, filling the room with their usual morning chatter and laughter, Sarah remained in her own world. During morning circle time, when the class sang their welcome song and shared weekend stories, Sarah kept glancing anxiously at the classroom door every few minutes, jumping slightly at any loud noise from the hallway. Mrs. Thompson had seen similar behavior patterns before in her long teaching career, and they always set off alarm bells in her mind. She made a mental note to speak with the school counselor during lunch break, but for now, she focused on creating a safe and comfortable environment for all her students, especially Sarah. The morning progressed with the usual kindergarten activities, alphabet practice, counting games, and art time, but Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake off the feeling that something was seriously wrong. She kept a watchful eye on Sarah while leading the class in their morning activities, noticing how the little girl barely touched her snack during break time and avoided eye contact with everyone, including her best friend Lucy. Little did Mrs. Thompson know that in just a few hours, 3 whispered words from Sarah would completely change both their lives, setting in motion a chain of events that would reveal a dark secret and test the limits of her role as an educator and protector of young minds. As the morning sunlight filtered through the classroom windows, Mrs. Thompson watched her students engage in their free play activities. The room buzzed with the usual sounds of children's laughter and chatter, but her attention kept drifting back to Sarah, who sat alone in the reading corner, absently flipping through pages of a picture book. During their math lesson, when the children were counting colorful plastic bears, Sarah dropped her collection of bears on the floor. The sudden clatter made her flinch so violently that several of her classmates turned to look. Mrs. Thompson noticed tears welling up in the little girl's eyes, though Sarah quickly wiped them away with her sleeve. "It's okay, sweetheart," Mrs. Thompson said softly, helping Sarah gather the scattered bears. "Accidents happen all the time. She noticed how Sarah's hands trembled as they picked up the bears together, and how the child seemed to make herself smaller, as if trying to disappear. Just before lunch break, the class had their daily show-and-tell session. Today's theme was My Weekend Adventure, and normally, Sarah loved sharing stories about her time with her mother at the park or their special Sunday pancake breakfasts. But when it was her turn, Sarah shook her head vigorously and mumbled, "I don't want to talk today." The change in Sarah became even more apparent during lunch. While other children chatted and traded snacks, Sarah sat picking at her untouched sandwich. Her best friend Lucy tried sharing her cookies, but Sarah barely acknowledged the gesture. Mrs. Thompson observed this from her desk while pretending to grade papers, her concern growing with each passing minute. After lunch, as the children settled down for quiet reading time, Mrs. Thompson received an unexpected visit from the school secretary. "There's been a change in Sarah Miller's emergency contact information," the secretary whispered, handing over a form. Her mother called this morning to add her boyfriend, Mark Stevens, to the pickup list. Something about this detail made Mrs. Thompson uneasy. She recalled Jennifer Miller's nervous behavior at their last meeting and how she had mentioned her new relationship. The timing of this change, combined with Sarah's recent behavior, set off warning bells in her mind. During art time, the children were asked to draw their families. Mrs. Thompson walked around the classroom, admiring the colorful stick figures and houses with crooked chimneys. When she reached Sarah's desk, she stopped short. Unlike her usual bright drawings, Sarah's paper showed dark, heavy crayon strokes in black and gray, with a small figure huddled in the corner of the page. "Can you tell me about your drawing, Sarah?" Mrs. Thompson asked gently, kneeling beside the girl's desk. Sarah quickly covered the drawing with her arms and shook her head. "It's nothing," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Can I throw it away?" Before Mrs. Thompson could respond, a loud slam echoed from the hallway, just someone closing a door too hard, but Sarah's reaction was immediate and alarming. She dropped her crayon and ducked under her desk, hands covering her ears. Mrs. Thompson quickly moved to comfort her, but Sarah scrambled away, backing herself against the wall. The other children stopped their activities, watching with confused expressions as their usually calm teacher tried to coax their frightened classmate out from her hiding spot. It took several minutes of gentle persuasion before Sarah emerged, her face flushed with embarrassment. Mrs. Thompson suggested she visit the nurse's office to rest, but Sarah frantically shook her head, gripping her teacher's hand with surprising strength. "Please don't make me go," she pleaded, her eyes wide with fear. "I want to stay here." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of activities, but Mrs. Thompson's instincts told her something was terribly wrong. She watched as Sarah repeatedly checked the classroom door, especially when footsteps passed by in the hallway. The little girl seemed to be carrying a weight far too heavy for her small shoulders, and Mrs. Thompson knew that tomorrow she would need to take action to help her student. What she didn't know was that tomorrow would bring a revelation that would shake her to her core, all starting with 3 simple words whispered in desperation. Tuesday morning arrived with a heavy fog blanketing the school grounds. Mrs. Thompson had barely slept the night before, her mind filled with worry about Sarah. She arrived at school extra early, hoping to catch Jennifer Miller during drop-off, but Sarah arrived with the same disheveled appearance as yesterday, this time accompanied by a young woman she recognized as Jennifer's sister. The morning routine began as usual, with children hanging up their backpacks and settling into their spots for circle time. Mrs. Thompson noticed Sarah's backpack looked unusually full today, bulging with what appeared to be extra clothes and her favorite stuffed animals. This detail made her stomach tighten with concern. During morning activities, Mrs. Thompson kept Sarah within her line of sight. The little girl seemed even more anxious than yesterday, repeatedly touching a small piece of paper tucked into her pocket. When the class broke into small groups for reading practice, Sarah remained at her desk, clutching her worn copy of Goodnight Moon, but not reading it. Around mid-morning, during the transition between math and snack time, the moment that would change everything finally arrived. While other children were busy getting their snacks from their cubbies, Sarah suddenly stood up from her desk. Her face was pale, and her small hands were trembling. Mrs. Thompson was organizing papers at her desk when she noticed Sarah walking toward her with unusual determination. The little girl's steps were quick but unsteady, as if she might change her mind at any moment. Other students were too busy with their own activities to notice, but Mrs. Thompson saw everything, the way Sarah's lower lip quivered, how her shoulders hunched forward protectively. When Sarah reached the desk, she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she glanced around the room nervously, checking to make sure no one was watching. Mrs. Thompson leaned down, bringing herself to Sarah's eye level, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "What is it, sweetheart?" she asked softly, keeping her voice steady despite her growing concern. Sarah's next actions happened in quick succession. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper she'd been touching all morning. Then, with trembling fingers, she pressed it into Mrs. Thompson's hand. Before the teacher could unfold it, Sarah leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke those 3 devastating words. "He's hurting, Mommy." The blood drained from Mrs. Thompson's face as the words registered. Her hands grew cold, and for a moment, the classroom sound seemed to fade away. She felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet, but years of experience helped her maintain her composure. Sarah wasn't finished. Now that she had started, the words tumbled out in a rushed whisper. "Mark hurt Mommy last night. She's hiding in her room. She told me not to tell, but..." Her voice broke, and tears started rolling down her cheeks. Mrs. Thompson's mind raced through protocol even as she gently pulled Sarah closer, shielding her from the view of other students. The piece of paper in her hand contained a clumsily written note in children's handwriting. "Help Mommy, please." The sight of it made her heart constrict. With practiced calm, Mrs. Thompson pressed the emergency button under her desk, a silent signal to the office that she needed immediate assistance. She knew she had to handle the next few moments carefully, keeping Sarah feeling safe while setting in motion the procedures that would protect both the child and her mother. "You did the right thing telling me, Sarah," she whispered back, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You're very brave, and I'm going to help you and your mommy. Can you be brave for just a little longer?" Sarah nodded, wiping her tears with her sleeve. Just then, Mrs. Martinez, the school counselor, appeared at the classroom door, responding to the emergency signal. One look at Mrs. Thompson's face told her something serious was happening. The next few minutes would be crucial, and Mrs. Thompson knew that Sarah's trust in her might have just saved 2 lives. As she stood up, still holding Sarah's hand, she silently thanked whatever force had given this little girl the courage to speak up today. The school counselor's office was designed to be welcoming for children, with soft chairs, colorful paintings, and a shelf full of stuffed animals. Mrs. Thompson sat beside Sarah while Mrs. Martinez gently began asking questions. The little girl clutched a purple teddy bear from the shelf, her knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. "Can you tell us what happened at home, Sarah?" Mrs. Martinez asked softly, keeping her voice calm and steady. She sat at a slight distance, giving Sarah space while maintaining a warm, approachable presence. Sarah looked at Mrs. Thompson for reassurance before speaking. "Mark came home angry last night," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He smelled funny, like Daddy used to smell before he went away." She paused, hugging the teddy bear closer. "Mommy told me to go to my room, but I could hear them yelling." Mrs. Thompson felt her heart breaking as Sarah continued. The little girl described hearing crashes and her mother crying. She explained how she had peeked out of her room and seen Mark pushing her mother against the wall, his hand raised. "Mommy saw me watching and told me to go back to my room and lock the door," Sarah said, tears running down her face. While Sarah spoke, Mrs. Martinez took careful notes, occasionally exchanging glances with Mrs. Thompson. The school principal, Mr. Roberts, had already been notified and was in his office contacting Child Protective Services. This morning, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, Mommy had blue marks on her arms. She wore her long-sleeve shirt even though it's warm outside. She couldn't drive because her eyes were too puffy from crying, so Aunt Lisa brought me to school. Mrs. Thompson noticed how Sarah kept looking at the clock on the wall. "Are you worried about something, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Sarah nodded vigorously. "Mark picks Mommy up from work at 5. He has a key to our house now. Mommy cries when she thinks I'm sleeping, and she keeps looking at the front door like she's scared." Just then, there was a soft knock at the office door. The school nurse, Mrs. Parker, entered with a small tray of milk and cookies. She had dealt with similar situations before and knew that sometimes children needed a moment to just be children. As Sarah nibbled on a cookie, Mrs. Martinez quietly excused herself to update Mr. Roberts. Mrs. Thompson remained with Sarah, noticing how the little girl's shoulders gradually relaxed as she realized she was truly safe in this space. "Sarah," Mrs. Thompson said carefully, "did your mom ever talk about wanting to leave? About going somewhere else?" Sarah's eyes lit up slightly. "She has a special bag hidden in my closet. She said it's for just in case. There's money in it, and pictures of me and her, and our important papers." She paused, then added, "Mommy said we might go visit Grandma soon, but she made me promise not to tell Mark." This information was crucial. It suggested Jennifer had been planning an escape. Mrs. Martinez returned just as Sarah was finishing her cookies, accompanied by two people in professional attire who introduced themselves as social workers from Child Protective Services. One of the social workers, Ms. Rodriguez, sat down near Sarah. "Your teacher tells me you're very brave," she said warmly. "We're going to help make sure you and your mommy are safe. Would it be okay if we asked you a few more questions?" Sarah looked at Mrs. Thompson, who nodded encouragingly. "Will Mark hurt Mommy again if I tell you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No, sweetheart," Ms. Rodriguez assured her. "We're going to make sure that doesn't happen. Right now, some other people from our office are already talking to your mommy at her work. You've done exactly the right thing by telling us." As Sarah began answering the social worker's gentle questions, Mrs. Thompson watched in amazement at the strength of this 5-year-old girl who, despite her fear, had found the courage to seek help. She knew that what happened next would be crucial for both Sarah and Jennifer's safety, but at least now they weren't facing it alone. The next few hours unfolded with careful precision. While Sarah remained in the counselor's office with Mrs. Thompson, a carefully orchestrated plan was put into motion. The social workers had contacted Jennifer at her workplace, a small accounting firm downtown, and a team of police officers was dispatched to ensure her safety. Jennifer broke down when the social workers arrived at her office. She had been living in fear for months, trying to protect Sarah while searching for a way out. The bruises hidden beneath her long-sleeved blouse told a story of escalating violence. When she learned that Sarah had spoken up at school, she alternated between tears of relief and terror, knowing Mark would be furious when he discovered they were planning to leave. Back at the school, Sarah had fallen asleep on the small couch in Mrs. Martinez's office, emotionally exhausted from the morning's events. Mrs. Thompson sat nearby, grading papers but constantly glancing at the sleeping child. The purple teddy bear remained clutched tightly in Sarah's arms, even in sleep. Around noon, Jennifer arrived at the school, escorted by a police officer and Ms. Rodriguez. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was a new determination in her stance. When she saw Sarah sleeping peacefully, she broke down again, gently stroking her daughter's hair. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "I thought I could handle it. I thought I could fix him like I couldn't fix Sarah's father." Her voice cracked as she spoke. Mrs. Thompson watched as Ms. Rodriguez explained the next steps. A domestic violence advocate had already secured spots for Jennifer and Sarah at a confidential shelter in a neighboring city. The police were waiting to arrest Mark when he arrived at Jennifer's workplace for their usual afternoon pickup. "We've already sent officers to your house," the police officer explained quietly. "They'll escort you to collect essential items, and then take you directly to the shelter. Mark won't know where you are." Sarah stirred awake during this conversation, and upon seeing her mother, launched herself into Jennifer's arms. "I was scared you'd be mad that I told," she mumbled into her mother's shoulder. "No, baby," Jennifer said, holding her daughter tight. "You did exactly what you should have done. You're my brave, smart girl." She looked up at Mrs. Thompson with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for listening to her, for seeing what I was too scared to face." The school principal entered the office with news that made everyone's breath catch. Mark had arrived at Jennifer's workplace early, demanding to know where she was. However, the police were ready, and he was already in custody. Several outstanding warrants from other states had appeared when they ran his record. Mrs. Thompson watched as relief washed over Jennifer's face. The young mother seemed to stand straighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Sarah, still holding her mother's hand, looked between the adults with growing understanding that things were going to change. Before they left for the shelter, Sarah ran back to Mrs. Thompson and hugged her tightly. "Will I still see you tomorrow?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Mrs. Thompson knelt down to eye level with her student. "Not tomorrow, sweetheart. You and your mom need to go somewhere safe for a little while, but I'll keep your seat right where it is, and all your artwork will be waiting for you when you come back." The domestic violence advocate arrived to escort Jennifer and Sarah to their house to pack, then to the shelter. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Thompson noticed Sarah had left the purple teddy bear on the couch. "Sarah, don't forget your new friend," she called out, but Sarah shook her head. "Can you keep him safe for me?" she asked. "Until I come back." Mrs. Thompson nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She watched as mother and daughter left the office, surrounded by people dedicated to their safety. The teddy bear in her hand served as a promise that Sarah would return, and when she did, she would find her classroom just as welcoming and safe as she left it. The next few days revealed the full extent of Mark Stevens' violent history. Detective Laura Chen sat at her desk, reviewing the mounting evidence against him. 3 previous domestic violence charges in 2 different states, all following a similar pattern. He would charm single mothers, move in quickly, and then the abuse would begin. At the police station, Mark maintained his innocence, claiming Jennifer was emotional and making things up. But the photographs of Jennifer's injuries, coupled with Sarah's detailed statement to the Child Advocacy Center, painted a different picture. The detective had seen many cases like this, but Sarah's bravery in speaking up had potentially saved not only her mother but future victims as well. Meanwhile, at the women's shelter, Jennifer and Sarah were beginning to adjust to their new temporary home. The facility was secure, with cameras and locked entries, providing a safe haven for families escaping domestic violence. Sarah shared a room with her mother, their few hastily packed belongings arranged neatly in the small space. During their first counseling session at the shelter, Jennifer finally opened up about the escalating abuse. It had started with small things. Mark checking her phone, questioning her about male coworkers, telling her what to wear. Then came the criticism, the isolation from friends and family, and finally, the physical violence. "I kept thinking I could change him," Jennifer confessed to her counselor, Maria. "Every time he apologized, I wanted to believe him. But when I saw the fear in Sarah's eyes..." She paused, wiping away tears. "That's when I knew we had to get out." Sarah was attending special counseling sessions designed for children who had witnessed domestic violence. Her counselor, Miss Emmy, used play therapy to help her process her experiences. During one session, Sarah built a castle with building blocks, complete with high walls and a moat. "This is where Mommy and I live now," she explained, placing 2 small dolls inside the castle. "The bad guys can't get in because it's too strong." Back at Riverside Elementary, Mrs. Thompson kept Sarah's desk just as she had promised. The purple teddy bear sat in her classroom cabinet, waiting for its owner's return. She had explained Sarah's absence to the other students simply by saying she was taking a special trip with her mom, but the empty desk served as a daily reminder of the little girl who had shown such remarkable courage. 2 weeks after Sarah's disclosure, Detective Chen brought more news. During their investigation, they had discovered 3 other women in the area who had similar experiences with Mark. One of them, after hearing about his arrest, came forward to press charges. Mark's bail was denied due to the severity of the charges and his history of crossing state lines to avoid prosecution. Jennifer's sister, Lisa, had been helping pack up their apartment, preparing for a fresh start. She found more evidence of Mark's controlling behavior: hidden cameras he had installed, a GPS tracker on Jennifer's car, and financial documents showing he had been stealing money from her accounts. At the shelter, Sarah was slowly returning to her cheerful self. She made friends with another little girl her age, and together they would play in the shelter's small but well-maintained playground. Jennifer noticed how her daughter seemed to stand taller, no longer jumping at sudden noises or looking over her shoulder constantly. During a meeting with their victim advocate, Jennifer learned about resources available to help them rebuild their lives. There were programs to assist with housing, job training, and legal support. The local domestic violence organization had already connected her with a pro bono attorney to help with obtaining a permanent restraining order. "You know," Jennifer said to her support group one evening, "I kept thinking I was staying with Mark to give Sarah stability, to avoid breaking up another home. But my 5-year-old daughter showed me what real strength looks like. She knew we needed help, and she wasn't afraid to ask for it. That night, as Jennifer tucked Sarah into bed in their shelter room, her daughter asked a question that brought tears to her eyes. "Mommy, are you proud of me for telling Mrs. Thompson?" Jennifer held her daughter close, knowing that their journey to healing was just beginning, but feeling truly safe for the first time in months. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "You're the bravest person I know." 1 month after fleeing their home, Jennifer and Sarah stood in the doorway of their new apartment. It was a modest 2-bedroom unit in a secure building across town, but to them, it felt like a palace. The domestic violence organization had helped Jennifer secure a housing grant, and her sister Lisa had rallied friends and family to donate furniture and household items. The living room walls, once stark white, were now decorated with Sarah's new drawings, bright, colorful pictures showing her and her mother smiling. Gone were the dark scribbles and hidden figures that had worried Mrs. Thompson weeks ago. A special corner had been set up as Sarah's art station, complete with fresh crayons and plenty of paper. Jennifer had found a new job at a women's boutique, where her manager understood her situation and was flexible with her schedule to accommodate court dates and counseling sessions. The store's security system and strict policies about unauthorized visitors helped her feel safe during work hours. Mark's trial was scheduled for the following month. The prosecutor, Ms. Ramirez, had met with Jennifer several times to prepare her testimony. She was nervous but determined. The evidence against Mark was substantial, and 3 other victims had come forward, creating a strong case that showed his pattern of abuse. "You won't have to face him alone," Ms. Ramirez assured Jennifer during their preparation meeting. "Sarah won't need to testify in person. We have her recorded statement from the Child Advocacy Center, and you'll have a support person with you in the courtroom." Sarah had started at a new school closer to their apartment. Her new teacher, Mr. Wilson, had been briefed about her situation and worked closely with Mrs. Thompson to ensure a smooth transition. On her first day, she found a familiar face waiting on her desk, the purple teddy bear from the counselor's office, cleaned and wearing a new ribbon. "Mrs. Thompson asked me to give this to you," Mr. Wilson had explained, watching Sarah's face light up as she hugged her old friend. "She says you're still the bravest student she's ever had." The weekly counseling sessions continued for both mother and daughter. Jennifer's support group had become a crucial part of her healing process. The other women understood her journey in a way nobody else could, offering advice and encouragement as she rebuilt her life. During one session, Jennifer shared a breakthrough moment. "Last night, I heard a car door slam outside, and for the first time, I didn't panic. I didn't run to check the locks or grab Sarah. I just reminded myself that we're safe now." Sarah's play therapy sessions showed remarkable progress, too. Her counselor noted how the themes in her play had shifted from protection and hiding to adventure and growth. The castle she built now had open gates and flowers growing around it. One afternoon, while Jennifer was at work, Sarah's Aunt Lisa was helping her decorate her new bedroom. As they hung butterfly decals on the walls, Sarah made an observation that brought tears to her aunt's eyes. "Mommy laughs a lot more now," she said, carefully placing a purple butterfly near her window. "And she doesn't look at her phone all worried anymore." The criminal investigation had uncovered more of Mark's past. Detective Chen discovered he had outstanding warrants in 3 states, all related to domestic violence and fraud. His pattern of targeting single mothers and isolating them from their support systems was well documented, making the case against him even stronger. Jennifer's restraining order was made permanent, and she enrolled in a self-defense class recommended by her support group. Each small step forward helped rebuild her confidence and sense of security. One evening, as Jennifer helped Sarah with her homework at their new kitchen table, she noticed something remarkable. Her daughter was humming while solving math problems, swinging her legs carefreely under the chair. The sight of Sarah returning to the carefree child she was meant to be made Jennifer's heart swell with pride and gratitude. "Mommy," Sarah asked, looking up from her worksheet, "can we get a cat? Mr. Wilson says pets help make a house feel more like home." Jennifer smiled, realizing they were finally in a place where they could think about such normal things. Their new life was taking shape, built on a foundation of safety, support, and the incredible courage of a 5-year-old girl who knew when to ask for help. 6 months had passed since that life-changing morning in Mrs. Thompson's classroom. The autumn colors had given way to spring blossoms, and with them came new beginnings for Sarah and Jennifer Miller. Mark Stevens had been sentenced to 12 years in prison with no possibility of early parole. His trail of abuse across multiple states had finally caught up with him. Jennifer sat in the courtroom during sentencing, surrounded by supporters, including Mrs. Thompson, who had taken a personal day to be there. When the judge announced the verdict, Jennifer felt years of fear finally dissolve. Their new apartment had transformed into a true home. A gray tabby cat named Luna, adopted from the local shelter, now ruled the household. Sarah had chosen her specifically because, as she explained, she looks like she needs someone to love her, just like we did. Luna could often be found curled up on Sarah's bed or watching birds from their living room window. Jennifer had received a promotion at the boutique, becoming assistant manager. Her boss had recognized her talent for organization and customer service, and the increased salary helped them feel more financially secure. She had also started taking online business classes in the evenings, working toward her dream of someday owning her own shop. Sarah continued to flourish at her new school. Mr. Wilson had noted her natural leadership abilities, especially when helping new students feel welcome. Her artwork now decorated not only their home, but also the school's main hallway, where her painting of a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis had won first place in the spring art show. One sunny Saturday morning, Jennifer and Sarah made a special visit to Riverside Elementary. They had been invited to speak at a teacher training session about recognizing signs of domestic violence. Mrs. Thompson had organized the event, believing their story could help other educators identify and assist students in similar situations. Sarah ran to hug her former teacher, now wearing a bright yellow dress that matched her sunny personality. "Mrs. Thompson, look what I made." She proudly presented a handmade card covered in butterflies and hearts. During the presentation, Jennifer shared their story with the gathered teachers. "My daughter saved both our lives," she explained, her voice strong and clear. "She trusted her teacher enough to ask for help when I was too scared to do it myself. That trust existed because Mrs. Thompson had created a safe space in her classroom and paid attention to the small changes in Sarah's behavior." The domestic violence organization where they had found shelter had asked Jennifer to become a peer counselor, working part-time with other survivors. She had accepted, knowing her experience could help others find their way to safety. Sarah would sometimes accompany her mother to the office, proudly telling anyone who would listen, "My mommy helps other mommies be brave." Their support network had grown stronger. Weekly dinners with Aunt Lisa became a tradition, and Jennifer had reconnected with old friends whom Mark had forced her to abandon. Sarah had playdates with her new school friends, their house filling with the sound of children's laughter that had been missing for so long. That evening, after their visit to Riverside Elementary, Jennifer and Sarah sat on their small balcony, watching the sunset while Luna purred between them. Sarah was working on a new drawing, this time of their little family, Jennifer, Sarah, and Luna, surrounded by flowers and sunshine. "Mommy," Sarah said, adding some sparkles to her artwork, "do you think there are other kids like me who need help telling their secrets?" Jennifer pulled her daughter close, kissing the top of her head. "Yes, sweetheart, there are. But because of you, more teachers know how to help them now. You've made a difference not just for us, but for other families too." As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Jennifer reflected on their journey. The fear and pain hadn't completely disappeared. There were still nights when unexpected noises made her heart race, and Sarah occasionally had nightmares. But they were healing, growing stronger each day, and most importantly, they were safe. Sarah's voice broke through her thoughts. "Can we hang my new picture next to my butterfly painting?" "Of course." Jennifer smiled, looking at the joyful scene her daughter had created. "It's perfect right there, where everyone can see how far we've come." The night wrapped around them like a warm blanket, full of peace and possibilities. Their story had become one of hope. Proof that even in the darkest moments, courage can bloom in the most unexpected places, even in the heart of a 5-year-old girl who dared to whisper 3 words that changed everything.